Bread, rice, potatoes, these are the very foods that people with diabetes are constantly told to give up. But here's the problem. These foods are staples in almost every culture on the planet. They're woven into our meals, our traditions, our comfort. So telling someone to just cut them out forever? Good luck with that, because it's simply not realistic for the long term. But here's the truth that most people never hear. You can absolutely eat these foods safely if you know how. I'm Dr. Thomas, and I want to show you how to enjoy your carbohydrates without sending your blood sugar on a roller coaster ride. I'm going to walk you through practical, science-based strategies that you can start using today to flatten those glucose spikes after your meals, and in the process, actually improve your insulin resistance over time. And a quick note before we dive in. Even though I'm a physician, I'm not your physician. So please talk to your own doctor before you make any changes to your diet or your medical regimen. So let's start with one of the most powerful, yet probably least known tools we have for this, and that is resistant starch. Now, most starches, things like bread and pasta and anything made out of flour, they break down into glucose very quickly, and this is exactly what raises your blood sugar so fast. And those repeated blood sugar spikes are what drive worsening insulin resistance, and over time that leads to pancreas dysfunction, which ultimately is what makes diabetes progressively worse. But resistant starch behaves in a completely different way. Your digestive enzymes are just not very good at breaking it down, so instead of being digested quickly and spiking your blood glucose, resistant starch travels all the way down to your large intestine, where your gut bacteria ferment it. And that fermentation process is what produces beneficial compounds like short-chain fatty acids, especially something called butyrate, which actually improves your insulin sensitivity, helps reduce inflammation in your body, and even feeds the lining of your colon cells. So how do you actually get more resistant starch? Well, here's a simple trick. You can take the typical starchy foods that would normally raise your blood sugar, and you just cool them down, then reheat them before you eat. By doing this, you increase the food's resistant starch content. So you can take your bread, your pasta, your rice, and when you cool it, part of the starch crystallizes into this resistant form. It's a process called starch retrogradation, where gelatinized starch molecules like amylose realign and form crystalline structures that resist digestion in your small intestine. So you can still enjoy your favorite foods, just cool them first and reheat them later to enjoy the metabolic benefits. And there are multiple studies showing that simply cooling cooked rice or potatoes down to around 39 degrees Fahrenheit for 24 hours significantly increases the resistant starch content compared to freshly cooked starches. And clinically, eating cooled and then reheated rice or potatoes leads to reduced post-meal glucose and reduced insulin spikes. So if you're eating at home, you do not have to give up bread or rice or potatoes. Just cool them or freeze them first, then reheat. It may not taste exactly the same, but it's going to be pretty close. And honestly, the benefits are very hard to ignore. Plus, there are many other foods that are naturally high in resistant starch that you can simply add to your routine. Things like beans, lentils, and peas, along with whole grains like oats and barley. Okay, the next principle is food pairing. Now, we rarely eat carbs completely on their own, and what you eat alongside your carbs can dramatically change your glucose response. There are studies like a meta-analysis of 154 trials showing that simply adding protein to a carbohydrate meal can reduce the glucose area under the curve by up to 50% in healthy adults. And we also have strong evidence that fat can blunt those early glucose spikes because fat helps delay gastric emptying and it can help with insulin clearance. And all of this eventually improves the beta cell function of your pancreas. So that's exactly why we don't want to eat starchy or processed carbohydrates in isolation. Some people call this avoiding naked carbs. That's why rice and beans together is usually far better than just rice alone. Or potatoes with butter or potatoes with olive oil will typically produce a gentler glucose spike compared to eating potatoes all by themselves. And another thing you can do is add acid to your meals. Things like vinegar, lemon, or lime, and many fermented foods can help here too. What they do is they slow down the rate at which starch is broken down, and vinegar in particular can help improve insulin sensitivity in your muscles, and it can actually blunt glucose spikes on its own by working on your liver's gluconeogenesis. I actually made a separate video all about the benefits of apple cider vinegar and how to use it properly, and I'll post a link to that video in the description below. And by the way, here's another way you can supercharge your food pairing. Eat your carbohydrates last, because food order genuinely matters here. If you start your meal with bread or juice, you get a sharp glucose peak right away. But if you eat your protein and your vegetables first, and then finish with your carbs, your stomach releases a slower, more gradual mix of glucose into your intestines. So you end up absorbing that glucose much more slowly. And the beauty of this is that it's the exact same food, but simply eating it in a different order gives you a completely different glucose curve. This becomes especially important in restaurants, where they love to bring you bread or nachos before your salad or your main entree even arrives. So eat your salad and your protein first, and then go for the bread or the nachos. It's a very small behavioral change, but it pays off with huge metabolic dividends. And there are multiple clinical studies proving exactly this. Like a randomized controlled crossover trial that showed people with type 2 diabetes who ate their protein and vegetables before their carbohydrates had a 40% lower glucose area under the curve and a 31% lower insulin area under the curve. And there was a more recent study out of Japan using continuous glucose monitors in healthy Japanese adults, and it showed that eating rice last significantly reduced post-meal glycemic excursions. Now, another thing that can make a big difference is walking right after a meal. We have studies like a randomized controlled trial showing that just a 10-minute walk immediately after eating can lower your post-meal glucose. And it doesn't even have to be walking. Any kind of light activity, like cleaning up in the kitchen or climbing a few stairs, can make a real difference. But walking is simply the most studied, and it's probably the easiest for most people to actually do. And you just have to remember that the best time to walk or move is as soon as possible after your meal. And the reason walking after eating is so powerful is because it activates your soleus muscles. The soleus is the muscle in your calf that runs from just below the knee down to the heel. And this soleus muscle is a metabolic powerhouse because it can soak up a large amount of glucose very quickly. Another thing that makes this muscle so special is that it's composed of slow twitch fibers, which allow it to sustain contractions for long periods without getting tired. So you end up burning lots of glucose over an extended period before your muscle fatigues. Okay, next. A lot of people will tell you to just cut out all carbs to reverse your diabetes and fix your insulin resistance, but it's really not the carbs themselves. It's the type of carbs that cause problems with insulin resistance and diabetes, because not all carbs are created equal. The way a carb is processed is what determines how fast it's absorbed and how fast it hits your bloodstream. So flour that's been milled into a fine powder, like white bread or instant oats, digests extremely quickly. But whole grains or coarser grains digest much more slowly, and they just don't cause the same problems as heavily processed carbohydrates. So think of it like kindling versus logs in a fire. Fine flour, which is what you find in white bread, cereal, pastries, and chips, is like throwing sawdust into the fire. It burns fast and it burns hot. On the flip side, you have your steel-cut oats, intact whole grains, and high-fiber carbohydrates. These burn more like logs, slower and more evenly. And for your body, that means smaller, steadier glucose curves instead of sharp spikes and crashes. So just like with resistant starch, choose carbohydrates that come from whole foods that are minimally processed and high in fiber. Fiber is probably the single most important carbohydrate you don't want to miss, especially if you choose to do a low-carb diet. Because for most people, the benefits of extra fiber are just too huge to ignore. And one last tip: do not eat late at night. The later you eat, the worse your glucose response tends to be. We have numerous studies showing that eating close to bedtime worsens your ability to process glucose, even if you're not eating a carb-heavy meal. And that's because physiologically, our insulin sensitivity and our pancreas's ability to secrete insulin follow a circadian rhythm. We simply can't process glucose as well in the evening as we can earlier in the day. And what makes this even worse is that late at night is when we get elevated levels of endogenous melatonin, which further reduces insulin secretion. And less insulin means more glucose lingering in your bloodstream. So the earlier you eat your dinner, the better. I'd recommend eating your last meal of the day, ideally at least 3 hours before bedtime. All right, I hope this was helpful for you. Stay healthy, and I'll see you in the next one.